On the 18th of this month, the 30 for 30 Phi Slama Jama documentary debuts on ESPN. I'm so excited to see this. And joining us is a member of that exclusive fraternity, REID GETTYS, who I believe is still the all-time assist leader for the Cougars. Thanks for joining us on the line, Reid. And do I have that right? Are you still the assist leader?
Yeah, it's hard to believe, but I think that's right.
As much as anybody, you've kind of become the Phi Slama Jama oral historian. And as I was thinking about this, more than ever, we need to tell the stories and put it into context, because I'm in my 40s and you can't be much younger than me to remember those teams. Were you as excited as ever when ESPN called and wanted you to relay the tall tales all over again?
You know, it's interesting. The guy that did it, his name's Chip Reeves. I think I'm pronouncing the last name right. It's Rives. He's a native Houstonian. You know, there's been so many kind of urban legends that have developed over the years, and most of it has been from the perspective of the NC State program. But it's funny because some of the stories have just grown and grown, and they are grossly inaccurate. And so when Chip called me originally and said he was thinking about doing this and would I be on board, I was more than a little skeptical because I didn't know his perspective. And the last thing I wanted was for somebody to come do something that was even remotely critical of Coach Lewis. And so he and I had a bunch of discussions about that and what, kind of thematically, what his approach was going to be, what he was hoping to communicate beyond just telling the story. He really sold me. He is an amazing producer. His research was just off the charts. I mean, I sat down with him for about 4 hours one day, and he told me so many things that it was amazing, Robert, where I'd go, is that right? I don't remember that. He'd pull out a box score, he'd pull out an article, or he just did an amazingly thorough job of researching those teams in that time period, and I'm excited to see it.
Just for the record, I won't even watch the 30 for 30 on Valvano and the NC State team. I can't do it.
Let me tell you an interesting story about that. And so the producer of that one called my house, and said, hey, I'm trying to get in touch with your husband, and told my wife what he was doing. And my wife's learned, over the years that somebody calling from NC State, there's a good chance I don't have any interest in participating. And it's funny because she said, yeah, he's probably not going to want to do that. And the guy that was producing that one didn't give up. And he said, well, let me ask a question. He goes, do you and your husband ever watch any of the 30 for 30s? My wife's like, well, yeah, we've watched a couple of them. He goes, well, which ones have you watched? And she goes, well, why are you asking? He goes, well, because I want your husband to see the work, the quality work of what my team puts together. And he goes, the most recent one that we did was the one on Marcus Dupree. And man, it was unbelievable. My wife goes, my husband will call you in the next 5 minutes. The guy was like, what? And it turns out my wife went to high school with Marcus Dupree. And
wow.
She grew up with Marcus. And so watching the Marcus Dupree 30 for 30 was like a biographical sketch on my wife's life. I mean, every person interviewed, every story she lived through and she knew. And she was so moved by how accurate and how fair and good that piece was. She laughed. She goes, yeah, my husband will call you in 5 minutes. So you can guess what I did. So I called in 5 minutes. And it ended up being a part of that. And I wasn't too thrilled with, same old thing. There's so many things that, people think are accurate and they want to read into it because it's kind of, history revision. But it was interesting being a part of that one as well.
Hey, we just found out Benny Anders, they found him, and here he'll appear in the film. It's one of Earth's great mysteries where he was. Are you excited they finally found him, or does it take away some of Benny's lore? I mean, it's not as fun when you know how Houdini made the building disappear.
Yeah, that's a good perspective. Here's the reality, and I don't mean to be over dramatical. I'm glad he's alive and healthy and safe.
Yeah.
Because it was such an incredible mystery, and the stories were really fun, and everybody wondering. And it's interesting because Chip called me and asked if I would go. Eric Davis and I were going to go down to Louisiana and spend about a week, trying to find him together. And it turns out I had a trial and couldn't do it and needed him to move it back, and he couldn't move it back. And so Eric went, Eric Davis and Lyndon Rose went down there, talking to those guys. I'm interested to see that piece because that was an insert after they finished all the filming. And Chip was convinced that to completely tell the story of those teams, he needed Benny, or needed to at least find him. When I talked to Eric and Lyndon last, the trail left off in Detroit, Michigan. And at that time, there wasn't any plans, or at least Chip didn't reveal any plans to go to Detroit and keep looking. So I'm fascinated. I talked to Chip about 2 weeks ago, and he told me he finally got a release date of the October, I think, 18th. And he said, I got a surprise for you. And I was like, well, what's the surprise? And he goes, I can't tell you. And I said, well, man, that's a bad teaser. When do I find out when do I find out what the surprise is? He said, you'll definitely find out on the 18th, but probably before then. So when the story hit a couple of days ago, man, it was about 11 o'clock at night when I saw it on Twitter, fired him off a text message, and I go, I assume this is your surprise. And he sent back, LOL. Yeah, it is. So it's really cool. It's going to be fascinating to hear where he's been and what he's been doing. In this day and age of social media, how in the world does he stay, how has somebody not said, hey, I'm in a restaurant with Benny Anders? It's a great story.
How good was he, and how strange was he, for those who don't know who Benny Anders was or his legend?
Okay, so let me put it into context. If you sat down with Drexler and you talked to him about Michael Jordan, he would, and part of this is what made Clyde so great, he would not concede 1 inch that Jordan was better than him. He just wouldn't. I mean, he would not. He would never say, I couldn't hang with Michael, or Michael was better. In no shape, manner, or form would Clyde ever admit to that. Having said that, I've sat at a dinner table and listened to Clyde tell people, Benny, shoot, he used to kill me in practice. So there's your context of your skill set. I mean, Benny was an inch shorter than I was. He's about 6'5". I think that's what they listed him at. And if he and I stood toe to toe, flat-footed, and raised our arms straight up above our head, my fingertips would come to the base of his hand. He had this remarkable wingspan and had a legitimate, bona fide 40-inch plus vertical leap, and wasn't just a leaper. I mean, he had this beautiful release and just a picture perfect jump shot. I mean, he was an absolute freak with his skill set and his ability to play basketball. So I guess that's 20%. That's 20% of the story.
But he would pull a gun on you, or is that one of those stories that we hear?
No, I was in the gym the day he did it. We're playing pickup, somebody arguing, a guy from TSU and Benny arguing over who had next up. And the guy went over and acted like he was going to grab this track, starter blocks. Those starter blocks, we were over in Robertson. I mean, guy grabbed it, like he was going to hit Benny with it. And Benny just calmly walked over to his bag and pulled out a gun and pointed it at him and said, I got next up.
What was it like during those layup lines before the game started and the visitors' gyms? If you could put us there, describe the reaction you'd get from the crowd.
It's funny because we were maybe Golden State, but not from the standpoint that, we were as great as Golden State. But Golden State's one of those teams that everybody wants their home team to beat, but you don't really hate them, right? I mean, you go and you want to see Steph Curry shoot the ball, and you want to see, now you're going to want to see Kevin Durant hype it. So you go not only hoping your team upsets them, but also to see the show. And that's what it was like back in those days. There would be huge crowds, and other than Fayetteville and College Station, you didn't really feel a lot of hatred. There were a lot of oohs and ahs and cheering, when spectacular plays were made. And so it was a unique team.
Boy, there's a lot of set of circumstances that have to go into making a team like this. But for those who don't remember or might not know, the slam dunk was outlawed from the late 60s until 76. Can you imagine, Reed, if you guys had come along 6 years earlier? This never happens.
Yeah. That's right. Or maybe a better question is, what would it have been like, and would this team have come along before then? You think about Elvin's teams and Don Chaney and all those guys, Theodis Lee and those guys that played during the time period when dunking wasn't allowed. And it wasn't that Guy Lewis just suddenly started recruiting athletes that could dunk. You know why that rule was in place, right?
Because of Lou Alcindor and the Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, I believe.
Yeah, that's what a lot of people say. And the reality is because it would be hard to replace backboards and rims during that time. And so if you allowed dunking, and that's why for a long time they didn't allow it in warm-ups, even after they allowed it in games, because they didn't want anybody bending a rim and then having to replace the rim or the backboard in the middle of the game. And then it became a rule, an NCAA rule, that you had to have backup equipment on site.
Well, since we're talking about Duncan, let's talk about the man, Hakeem Olajuwon. You see him for the first time. What do you remember about that?
Skinny.
Yeah,
he was so skinny. And it's funny because Hakeem showed up, and I think he got here maybe in December or January, but mid-semester, and they redshirted him because he physically wasn't ready to play. So that December that he showed up, and they decided to redshirt him for that one semester instead of burning a year just to play a semester. I was a senior in high school. The day that Coach Lewis and Coach Swerock came out to my house for a home visit was the same day that the old Houston Post ran an article on Hakeem. And he's on the front page and, hanging off the basketball standard and just looked like he arms and legs that just went forever. It was interesting because we were, my dad and I were talking about it. My dad was talking about, I wonder what it'd be like to play with that guy. And so when Coach Lewis and Coach Swerock were in my house that evening, my dad and I and Mom, we were sitting around talking to them. And I said, hey, can I ask a question? And they were like, yeah, sure. I said, what about this Hakeem Olajuwon guy? And they both kind of looked at each other and smiled. And Coach Lewis goes, well, what about him? I said, is he any good? And they smiled and they go, not yet. And I said, but you think he's going to be good? And they smiled, with this, knowing look between them. And Coach Lewis goes, yeah, we think he's going to be pretty good.
Yeah, whatever happened to him. Hey, Guy V, the memorial service, you did a fantastic job doing the eulogy, and it was great to hear the memories of Coach. What do you remember about meeting him for the first time? I know you played down the street at Memorial High School. Did he come see you play?
The first time I met him, I'd met Coach Swerock before I met Coach Lewis. But my high school team was playing a playoff game in Hallfines Pavilion. The only school I ever wanted to go to was Texas Tech. My dad was a 4-year All-American at Texas Tech. And so I grew up dreaming of playing for the Red Raiders. And so we're playing a high school game, a playoff game against Madison. And Eric Dickens, who ended up being a U of H teammate, was the star for Madison. And so we're playing, I'm at Memorial. So we're playing Madison in this bi-district game. And warming up, I look over at the table down on the court, and Gerald Myers, the coach of Texas Tech, and Guy Lewis are sitting there next to each other. I didn't think anything else about it. We played the game. We ended up losing at the very end. Coach Lewis overheard. Gerald Myers was very, very honest and very, transparent, and he didn't play any games. And he came up to me and just said, sorry about the loss. Basically said, I don't think you can play for us at Texas Tech. And Coach Lewis walked up right behind him and said, do you know who I am? I was like, yes, sir. I'm a native Houstonian. He said, well, you may not be able to play for Gerald Myers, but you can play for me. And that's the first time I met him.
Yeah, that's great. What do you remember about the 82 Final Four? You go up against James Worthy and then a baby-faced kid named Michael Jordan. But Sam Perkins, if I remember, was the guy that really gave you trouble. Really, I think he had 25 points that game.
It's funny, I don't remember Jordan at all. I remember Perkins and how good he was. But the guy that we were concerned about was James Worthy. And Worthy I can't remember what his numbers were, but I know he had a good game, but not spectacular. But he did something that I never saw anybody do and never saw anybody do again. Worthy catches the ball out about 25 feet on the left wing, makes one jab step towards the baseline, and comes right across I mean, just right across the middle of the lane, and there's nothing in between him and the basket except Larry Mishaw. And James Worthy took off and dunked so hard on Mishaw. I mean, just absolutely cranked one. And all of us on the bench looked at each other and went, oh my gosh, did you see that? I mean, we're trying hard not to laugh, or give each other high five for a play from another team. But let me tell you, nobody dunked on Mr. Mean. I mean, nobody. Not in practice, not in games, nobody dunked on Larry Mishaw except James Worthy. And I'll never forget that play and just how all of us on the bench were like, oh my.
And he had those big hands the way you described Benny's hands. He had those. It seemed like the ball was like a Nerf ball in his hands, right?
Yeah, just awesome. But he was 6'9" and smooth and started out on the wing and could handle. And the only thing I remember I remember Perkins was really, really good. I don't remember Jordan at all. Jordan hit that game-winning shot in the championship game, and that's kind of when everyone started talking about Michael Jordan. But in the semifinal, I just don't remember much. But man, Worthy, he was the real deal.
But you got to remember the Louisville game, right? What was it like to be involved in that one?
The thing that jumps out at me the most was you had two teams that played the exact same style with the same strengths, the same weaknesses. There was nothing gimmicky. It was absolutely just mano a mano. Just, we're going to come out and we're going to trap and press and run it down your throat. We're going to jam the accelerator down to the floorboard, and we're going to keep it there for 40 minutes. And they came out with the approach, we're going to press and trap and run and jam the accelerator down to the floorboard and run it down your throat. It's interesting, Robert. I haven't seen the 30 for 30 yet, but I'm not very good at hyperbole, just because I guess because I've called college basketball for ESPN for the last 30 years, but I'm not very good at saying, oh, we changed the game, or we were the greatest team that never won. But there's a lot to be said for that game simplifying the game of basketball and having an impact on the way it was played going forward. It's interesting how many coaches, what was once deemed as undisciplined run and gun, it's amazing how many of the concepts and the presses and the traps and the free-flowing offense and emphasizing transition, it's amazing from that game forward how many programs and teams and coaches adopted that philosophy.
Well, I'm putting off the NC State for as long as possible because I don't want to talk about it just yet. But I do have one question, but I want to ask you because Rodney McCray was on that Louisville team, and in a few months he ends up getting drafted by the Rockets, and now everybody in Houston was upset. It turns out rightly so because the Rockets passed up Clyde. Were you stunned when that happened, when they didn't draft Clyde and they drafted Rodney?
No. I mean, that's history revisionism because Rodney coming out of college was a better player than Clyde. People forget Clyde couldn't shoot outside of about 8 feet. I mean, he was a 6'7" power forward. He dribbled looking at the ball. He had his head down. He couldn't shoot a jump shot. He just had this phenomenal motor and this incredible athleticism. And Clyde made himself into a Hall of Famer. He had the skills and the athletic, God-given athletic ability, but he turned himself into a scorer and into a playmaker. And really, I hate to call him a shooter, but he was. And he had none of that in college. That just isn't who he was because Clyde was a teammate. If I was a GM, I'd have taken Clyde. But the reality is, I bet if you put 10 GMs in the room, I bet 8 of them would pick Rodney over Clyde back then. And it's fun because when the Rockets drafted him back in those days, we spent so much time playing pickup ball with the Rockets and all their guys that we all became really good friends with Rodney. I think everybody on our team, would consider, Rodney being a really good friend, and he's such a good dude. And it's fun to hear him tell stories, kind of like, we have our perspective of the NC State game. Louisville has their perspective of our game. And so it was fun over the years to hear him laugh and joke and talk about that game.
Yeah, I was wondering if you'd got to know him because, of course, yeah, he made his home in Houston for a while, and then he gets traded in the deal that gets the Rockets Otis Thorpe. They win a championship with him. Then Thorpe gets dealt for Clyde, and we know how that ended. Did it mean something for you when you saw Hakeem and Clyde win the title in '95?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it was great. So I guess I have from several different perspectives. My family had Rocket season. I'm a native Houstonian, and my family had Rocket season tickets from the first day they came from San Diego. So we used to have season tickets when they played over at the Coliseum, and then they played a year or two at Hofheinz Pavilion before the Summit was built. I was a diehard Rocket fan ever since I remember, back to age 5 or 6. Growing up with Mike Newland and Murphy and Tomjanovich and Otto Moore and Rudy White and Cliff Neely and, Jack Marin. So I grew up, you couldn't have had a bigger Rocket fan than our family. So number one, the fact that they were in a position to win a championship, but then add to it, 2 teammates and 2 guys that I couldn't have been pulling harder for. Boy, that was just what a special time that was. Not only in the city of Houston, but also for the University of Houston alumni.
Let me ask you about NC State. And forever and ever, we'd see the end of that game during the NCAA tournament. And most of the time, when you lose a game as a player, you don't have to relive it over and over again nationally. Did it make it hard for you to watch the tournament at times when you never know when they're going to show that ending one more time?
No. Let me tell you the funniest time that I saw that ending. So I played 1 year in the CBA with the Albany Patroons. Our point guard for the Albany Patroons was Sidney Lowe.
Oh, yeah.
And everybody credits, of course, Lorenzo Charles for catching the air ball and dunking it. And everyone talks about Derek Wittenberg, who was their best player, and Cozell McQueen. The guy that won the national championship for him was Sidney Lowe. Sidney Lowe was spectacular in that championship game. I spent a lot of the game gardening. And the scouting report was I was kind of left as a rover. I could roam and double down and dig down on the bigs and shade over towards Wittenberg because the scouting report was that Sidney Lowe can't beat you. Well, after he hit about his 5th or 6th jump shot, that scouting report went out the window. And Sidney Lowe was the difference in that game. So Sid and I, we're in the CBA playoffs, and we are in, I want to say Casper, Wyoming, some godforsaken place. And we're sitting in the airport and we're sitting there in the bar waiting for the plane, having a burger. He and I have never talked about the game. Not one time did we talk about the game. And so it's just the 2 of us sitting there and we're watching the TV and it's NCAA tournament time and up pops the replay. And we're sitting there, it's dead quiet. It's probably 1 a.m. We're waiting for a red eye. Nobody else in the entire restaurant, and I had the same thought. Just kept going through my mind. Don't look at him. Don't look at him. Don't look at him. And sure enough, I look over at him, and he's got this little smart ass grin on his face, and he's holding his left hand up, and he's twisting his national championship ring.
Oh no!
I was like, you dog. I mean, what are the chances of that playing out where I'm sitting in a restaurant with Sidney Lowe having dinner and watching that replay? That was miserable.
Oh, my goodness. One of the things that you hear is the altitude in Albuquerque. Was it that big of a difference? Do you feel like the Final Fours played somewhere else and maybe you guys are a little bit better in that final game?
No. The first answer to your question, was it a big deal? The answer is yes, absolutely. It was a huge big deal. It was hard to catch your second wind, but then you fatigued. It was a significant impact. But come on, it was NC State isn't up in the mountains. Louisville's not in some high altitude. We all played in the same conditions. So I think it had an impact on the game, but I think it had equal impact on everybody.
One of the amazing things about those teams was all the local talent. You played for Memorial. Mr. Mean played for Worthing. Clyde was at Sterling. Michael Young at Yates. I'm probably forgetting some of the guys, but
Eric Dickens at Madison. Alvin Franklin was at Lamarck. Gary Orsack was at Alvin. So the entire team, with the exception of Clyde, the entire team.
And you once said that Guy V could recruit, or Guy V said he could recruit that team on a bicycle.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. And that was really cool too. It was cool that it was the city's team. And, anytime you say that, you got to go, yeah, the big Nigerian had a little bit to do with that also. But it was a really, it was a unique team. And really, it's always been the formula of success at University of Houston. And it's exactly what Tom Herman's doing right now. And it's what Kelvin Sampson's, trying to do. And that is the formula for that program, for that school athletically to be successful.
I wanted to ask you one thing about Michael Young, because his boys has played over at Yates, and I even did a story on his daughter, who's a hell of a track star at Lamar. And then Joseph gets drafted by Larry Bird's team, the Pacers. The big irony is Michael was drafted in the first round by the Celtics back in the day, and probably spent some time with Larry at that point. But what was it like playing with Michael?
Clyde and Hakeem kind of sucked the air out of the room as far as attention goes. Mike was such a stud. I mean, he had this unorthodox, kind of ugly-looking left-handed jump shot. He overextended. It was back behind his release point was back behind his head. Absolutely the purest, best shooter maybe I've ever seen. To have that ugly of a shot, it's kind of like Sean Marion, where the smartest thing somebody did early on was not change it, because if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And Mike was, golly, he was so good. And he's 6'6", 6'7", at the time, probably, 225. Look, was more cut than half the football players on campus, and could have walked out and been a NFL tight end or middle linebacker. I mean, just an absolute specimen. Never got tired, never complained. Kept his mouth shut and just killed people. I mean, he was so good. And I'm not sure that he'd always, because he didn't go on and have a Hall of Fame NBA career. To me, he's the one guy that kind of gets lost as far as our superstars. And, man, he was a superstar in every shape of the word. He was an absolute stud. I had so much respect for Mike and the way he went about his life and the way he conducted himself on the court and off the court, and huge admiration for Mike Young. Mike Young was lifting weights before anybody in basketball was lifting weights. He grew up with a guy, and I can't remember his name, who was a strength coach, and Mike would go to his garage in high school, and turned his body into this unbelievable specimen at a time that nobody else was doing that in college basketball.
Man, it's hard to believe it's been 32 years since the last Phi Slama Jama team, I guess 94 or 84, with the loss to Georgetown in the finals. And the Cougars haven't won a tournament game since then, 32 years later. Can you believe that? And is this the year that maybe they can finally get over that hump?
Yeah, Kelvin Sampson's a stud. Yeah, I am such a Kelvin Sampson fan. I covered Kelvin for ESPN when he was in the Big 12 at OU. And you talk about a guy that absolutely has gotten it done every step of the way. Montana Tech or Montana State, whatever the name of the small school in Montana was. Then he's at Washington State, and then he's at OU. And he absolutely is one of, he got stigmatized with the NCAA, legal contact calls, and he goes to the NBA. Turns into one of the best NBA assistants in the league, found his niche. The fact that we got him at U of H, I can't tell you how proud I was of the school and what a great hire that was at the time, and it has been. He's as fine a basketball coach as you're going to find anywhere in America. It's a shame because James Dickey, the coach before him, is maybe the only coach really since Coach Lewis that left the program in better shape than he found it. So Mike Young's kid leaves before Kelvin gets there. He ends up being Pac-12 Player of the Year. Daniel House leaves the same year. He ends up being first team All SEC. And Tayshaun Thomas leaves, goes to OU, and is first team All Big 12. So think if Kelvin had inherited the Pac-12 Player of the Year and 2 first team, if he'd inherited those guys, this would be a moot discussion. Instead, because of issues completely unrelated to Kelvin and his staff, those kids all leave. And so he's starting, with the cupboard bare. I mean, bare. And he's building it the right way. He's got a really great core of kids. Rob Gray is a superstar. Boy, you talk about one of the best scorers in America. That's Rob Gray. And then I'm really high on Galen Robinson also. He is, boy, what a great recruiting job to get that kid out of Westbury Christian. And he is skilled. He's talented. He's got the perfect chip on his shoulder. Got a little bit of a tough, not a little bit. He's got a little bit of a chip on his shoulder, but he's got a toughness that he will thrive with Kelvin Sampson. As the pieces started getting put together, I wish Devontae Pollard was back another year because Kelvin salvaged that kid's career. But man, he's putting the pieces together. I haven't seen any of the new kids yet, but I'm anxious to get out and see them. But that's a 20-minute answer to the question, is this the year that we're going to see him win an NCAA tournament? I don't know, but I do know the program's headed in the right direction. Last year they exceeded expectations and ahead of schedule, and I expect the same thing this season.
What's it going to be like to walk into that new arena for you?
Oh, great. I mean, just great. It's embarrassing, the condition of that, and the fact that Kelvin's still been able to recruit and sell kids on a vision. But, it's the same thing Tom Herman did. It's what Kelvin did with, our practice facilities can go toe to toe with anybody in America. Kelvin did that. He came in, looked at what they had planned and said, no, if you're committed to this administration and we're going to do this the right way, we're going to start over with the design. And through an incredibly generous gift, for some reason it doesn't get much publicity. David Mars, a former player for Coach Lewis back in the 70s, wrote a check, he and his wife, for that facility, or a huge, significant percentage of it. And his name's on the guy on the men's court, and his wife's name's on the women's court. But really cool that was donated by a former player and a native Houstonian. David Mars grew up in Houston and played at Lamar High School. And so things are headed in the right direction. They need that new facility. They need to gut Hofheinz. It's 15 years past its prime. Man, it was old when I was there in the 80s. We still had a rubber court for 2 years or 3 years and then finally replaced it with a wood court, but it was old then. It's unbelievable they've still been playing in it all these years. So I'm excited. I'm excited for the Fertitta Center.
Yeah, that strange circle of life, too. Kelvin Sampson's first point guard was L.J. Rose, and that's Lyndon's son, and you played with him, right, at U of H during that period.
Yeah, one of my best friends today, Lyndon. And it's interesting. Lyndon's son graduated, still had eligibility, and he transferred to BYU and playing for another teammate, David Rose.
Oh, yeah.
He's going to be in BYU this season. I hope he stays healthy. Boy, kid's just had unbelievable run of bad luck, breaking bones in his feet.
Yeah, that was awful. Well, man, I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. I can't tell you how much I'm looking forward to seeing the film, but it was just great to really get the chance to talk to you about Phi Slama Jama and all the great memories that you guys gave us that were all the fans and the kids back in that time.
Well, thanks. I enjoyed it as well, and really looking forward to the 30 for 30. I hope it does justice, and I hope it's something that will honor Coach Lewis.
For more interviews, subscribe to Houston Sports Talk on iTunes, or if you're an Android user, download our free Houston Sports Talk app in the Google Play Store. We're also available on Stitcher or the TuneIn app, and our website is houstonsportstalk.net.